Hi, this is Eric for Otoy. In this video, we're going to take a look at working with the universal material when rendering with Octane for Unity. And I'm using the space filling station scene, which you can see rendered in Octane right here and here in the Unity viewport. So there's a few things I wanted to point out before we get into the universal material. First of all, let's take a look at what version of Octane I'm using. So currently I'm using 1.1.1.1341. And this is using Octane version for RC5. So you want to make sure you're using at least those versions to follow along in order to use these features. So as you can see, I'm rendering in the Octane PBR viewport right here. In the Unity viewport, you can see how some objects look blank and others have textures on them. In some cases, I have Octane materials applied to these surfaces. So for instance, a lot of these structures have Octane materials applied to them, so they show up in Unity as white. But when we render them, you can see that they are nice and metallic and have all kinds of cool detail. If we take a look at our little robot guy, he has a Unity standard roughness material applied with some textures. And you can see it does render in Octane. However, he doesn't look quite as nice as he could. So let's zoom in here real quick and take a look at this. So you can see he looks all right, but it's a little bit dull. Let's fix the focus here. So I'm going to pick the focus so that we can see him clearly. And there he is. It looks all right. Not quite as exciting as he could be. So let's take a look at the materials applied to the robot here. They're called Barbot because originally he's a bartender. So I have 3 materials applied to them, and they're all set to standard roughness setup. And you can see they have textures applied to them. I've also created an Octane PBR override material. So if I switch to that, Octane PBR override, I've already set this up so that it uses the correct textures. But you can see when I render, you can see the bottom is starting to look a little bit nicer, but he's looking sort of blank here in the Unity preview window. So that's just what I wanted to point out. I'm going to go in here and set the Barbot so that he's using the PBR override material for all his parts. Now he's looking nice and shiny. The same is true of this sort of recreational vehicle spaceship that's filling up behind him. So let's select the focus here. And the materials that are applied to this spaceship are called Spaceship Material 1 and Spaceship Material 2. So I'm going to select these, and again, let's switch these to Octane PBR override. And you can see I've already set these up. So let's select this one. Same thing, Octane PBR override. Now the spaceship's looking a little bit more interesting visually. Okay, so let's get into the business of creating universal materials. And for this example, I have one spaceship in here that doesn't have any materials applied to him, so it's this limousine spaceship. As you can see, it's a long stretched limousine. So the first thing we want to do is create materials for the spaceship. The spaceship, this limo here, which we'll find here, you can see is made up of 2 parts. So we have the wings, which is called Limo 1001, and then the main part of the limousine, which is called Limo 1002. I've already created textures for the limousine using Substance Painter. So you can see here it is right here with the textures. And the spaceship and the original texturing was created by Jeffrey Homan. So we want to give him some credit for that. It's a very nice, cool spaceship designs. And I've just basically taken his model and his textures into Painter and kind of played with them a little bit to come up with sort of a typical PBR texture workflow. So I've exported the textures. And I've got base color, roughness, metallic, normal, height, emissive. I'm not really using scattering or specular level, but I do have an AO texture as well. So what I'm going to do is let's go back into Unity here. And let's create a couple materials and then import our textures. So let's close this for the moment. And I'm going to go down here to the assets in the material folder and create a material. So let's call this limo 1001 matte, just to be consistent. And I'm going to drag this over limo 1001 to apply it. And let's create another material. Limo 1002 MAT, matte. Create that, and then we'll drag this over limo 1002. So in the textures folder under assets, I've created a limo textures folder. So let's go in here and import our textures. I'm just going to select these all and import them. All right, there we go. So let's go back to materials and start editing our materials. So I'm going to select limo 1001 material. Let's set this to standard roughness setup. And I just like to create a standard roughness setup material so that I can toggle between this and the Octane override material in case I want to see the textures here in the viewport. I'll use the standard roughness setup. So now let's connect our textures. So we want to choose albedo. It's going to be limo 1001 base color, metallic, roughness. We can of course do a search here for limo. Makes it a little bit easier. Make sure that this is actually a normal map, so we'll fix it. We can actually create a height map in here. And occlusion. AO. So that is our wings. So I'm going to pause this for a moment and just do the same thing for limo 1002 so we have all the textures connected. It's the same process. So you can see with all the texture applied, it looks pretty good. But that of course is the standard roughness material. And of course this will actually render in Octane for Unity. So if I go to the PBR render target and choose to render, let's set this to denoise so it's a little bit faster. So you can see, yeah, it's rendering and it looks pretty good, but I think we can get something that looks more impressive if we're actually using the Octane universal materials. So let's take a look at setting that up. So let's start with limo 1002 matte because it's the one that's applied to the main body here. And I'm going to set this to Octane PBR override. You can see it turns white again. And let's close this for a moment. And let's add some textures. So I'm going to add a few textures. Click on this. And once again, same process, limo 1002 base color. Let's do limo 1002 AO. Doesn't matter what order we're choosing them in. This just allows them to show up in the Octane editor when we go to view source. Okay, so now we have all our textures. Now what we need to do is actually edit the material. So for that, we'll click on the View Source button, and this will pull up Octane Standalone. And you can see here are the textures that we just added in the node editor. And here's material out. So what we need to do is create a material and then hook up these textures. So I'm going to right click and choose Materials, Universal. This material is designed to work with substance textures. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start connecting these. So this will take a little bit of messing around. Let's find our base color. There we go, base color. And let's hook this into albedo. And let's also hook it into specular. We're not seeing any change because of course we got to connect the universal material to material out. There we go. That's looking a lot better. Now we can go to metallic and let's hook this into metallic. And let's select roughness and hook this into roughness. So you can see the labels light up as I bring the wire close to them. So that's how I know how to hook them up correctly. Let's do the normal into normal map. So to hook up our emissive, let's right click over here and choose emission, texture emission, and connect this to emission. And then let's get this out of the way. Put that into texture. Let's rotate a view around. Turn on surface brightness and you can see now our little engine lights are on. And we can do things like adjust the power and so on. Let's rotate around to the front. You can see we've got some headlights here that are glowing. And this is the result. So let's close this for a second and just do a quick PBR render. Let's select PBR render target and do a render. And we can zoom in and rotate around and check out the result. Now, of course, this is just the default universal material settings with some textures plugged in. The real power of the universal material comes when you start to adjust its settings. But let's take a look at the wings here because the wings are still using the standard material. Let's select Limo 1001 matte and set this to Octane PBR override. The wings and the ramp turn white. So let's add our texture. So I'm going to go through the same process I did before to add the textures. So let's pause this for. So now you can see I have the textures added. So if I click on a view source, you can see down here in this tab we have Limo 1001 matte, and we have all of our textures and the material out. So I'm going to use a little trick to save some time. Before I actually hook up these textures to a universal material and connect it to material out, I'm first going to make some changes on Limo 1002 material. That's the one that's applied to the body here. Because then once I've made some changes and I kind of like the way the material looks, I can simply copy and paste it over to Limo 1001 matte, this tab, which will save me a lot of time. So let's do that. So of course, now we have the fun part, which is to kind of adjust the material. So let's get a view where we can see kind of the side here. And go back into our node editor. And select the universal material. A lot of the settings that you'll find in the Octane materials, diffuse, glossy, metallic, and specular, have been included in this universal material. So it's kind of an uber material you can use for shading all types of different surfaces. So if we select it, I don't want to do anything to transmission. You can see here are the textures. Let's collapse some of these so it's easier to see what's going on. We have a choice of BSDF models here. GGX is actually the most popular. This controls sort of how the specular reflections and anisotropy and microfaceting works on the surface to make it look more like a realistic material. So the way the universal material works is it blends between a glossy material and a metallic material, depending on the setting for the metallic input. So right now I have a texture map plugged in the metallic input. Let's disconnect that for a moment. And also let's disconnect base color from the specular input. And for specular input, let's actually add grayscale color. Let's put that into specular. And let's do the same. Let's do the same for the metallic input. So the grayscale color goes between 0 and 1. So if I set this all the way to 1, then we have a pure metallic material. If I set this all the way to 0, we have a glossy material. And this is important because it controls how the index of refraction works on the material. So if I select the material, and let's go down to, let's set the specular all the way up, just to make it nice and obvious. So I can start to control the index of refraction using the dielectric IOR. So if I set this to like 2.8, you can see it gets much more shiny. So since we have our metallic input is 0, the dielectric IOR is controlling the index of refraction because this is essentially now a glossy material. All right. So if I go to my metallic input and set this all the way to 1, in this case, the dielectric index of refraction no longer has any effect. If I change it around, it doesn't do anything. In this case, we're going to start working with the metallic reflection mode because our material is now a metallic material. And we have 3 different ways to deal with it. We can use the default metallic mode, which uses the albedo color to control the index of refraction. We can also use IOR plus color. With metallic reflection mode set to IOR plus color, this basically means that I can use these 2 fields to control the index of refraction. So these 2 values refer to the N and K value of the index of refraction. Think of this as being sort of the traditional index of refraction value. So if I put this in like 2.8, we get an index of refraction, and then this controls the strength of the Fresnel effect. So if I set this up to like 2, you can see we get kind of a shinier result. But you also see on these gold parts, it's using the albedo color to control the color of the metallic surface. So we get more of a gold reflection on these parts, and you can sort of see some color variation in the specular highlights on the other part. So if I really increase this, it becomes more and more apparent. So let's just set this back to say 1.5 or something like that. The RGB IOR is the most physically accurate method for calculating metallic index of refraction. So let's set this to RGB IOR, and this requires a little bit of messing around to find the appropriate values. And in this case, we're going to use all 6 of these values. So these are all the N values for red, green, and blue channels, and these are the K values for red, green, and blue channels. So how do we figure out what these values are? Well, there's a great website you can go to called refractiveindex.info. And what we're going to do is we're going to plug in different wavelength values here to determine the N and K values. So let's first start by picking a metal. So we can select selected data for 3D artists. We can choose metal, and let's choose, say, aluminum, just for fun. So if I put in .65, that's the red wavelength value, I get a refractive index of 1.3456 and a K value of 7.4746. So then what I can do is plug those values into these first 2 fields. So that's going to be 1.3456 and 7.4746. Now for the green wavelength, we'll type 55.55, and we get 0.96521 and 6.3995. So green channel 0.96521 and 6.3995. So you can see the colors are changing there accordingly. And then finally, for the blue channel, we'll type in 0.45, and we get these 2 values, 0.61722 and 5.3031. 0.61722, 5.3031. And then this is the result. So you can see we're getting sort of a straight up metallic aluminum color to the surface of the limousine. So if we go back to our metallic input, you can see as I move over to 0, I'm getting more of that glossy material look. If I move over to 1, I'm getting more of metallic material look, and then I can blend in between. Or I can hook up a texture. It could be a procedural texture, or in this case, maybe I want to use the metallic texture that was created by Substance. So you can see now the windows are going back to their sort of glossy look. So these black glossy shaded windows. And then of course I have a metallic surface for the rest of the limousine. I could select my metallic texture and do things like play with power, gamma. I could blend it with procedural textures and other textures and so on. Let's go back to the universal material, and I'm going to set my metallic reflection mode to IOR plus color. So for this particular model, I do like to use the IOR plus color mode because it's using that albedo texture to tint the reflections, especially on these gold parts right here, which I think that looks kind of nice. So I'm going to do a couple things just to improve upon this material a little bit. It's a little bit too mirror-like at the moment. I like to have the highlights and reflections spread out a little. So what I'll do is I'm going to go to the roughness texture and lower the gamma. So if I lower the gamma, it's going to change the mid-value of the texture, making it a little bit lighter, so making it rougher, and spreading out that highlight a little bit more so it looks more worn, not so perfect. And then also I can increase the anisotropy, and that will affect, you can see it in these highlights and reflections right here, the bright spots. Maybe change the rotation a little bit so it's kind of spread out this way. Other things that I can do, I can add a coating layer. So if I'm going to make this kind of like green just so it's a little bit obvious how it works. And we'll change the color later, but you can already see there's a slight green tint or a coat to it. So it can kind of play with the roughness of that. And you can see it starts to look like there's just a little bit of a sheen, maybe a layer of dust or something like that on here. And it even has its own index of refraction. So if I bring it up, you can see it really starts to look pretty obvious. So let's bring down the coating IOR and the roughness, and let's set this to a light color. Or the other thing we can do is we can use this ambient occlusion texture to go into the coating, that coating color. So what I'm going to do is find the coating. There's a coating input. So I have the ambient occlusion texture going into that. And then I'll go back into the coating settings. And we can play with the roughness and the index of refraction. So now it looks a little bit dusty based on the ambient occlusion texture. So if I select that ambient occlusion texture and hit that eyeball icon, you can see what it looks like. So in some of these crevices here, we won't see that coating. It's kind of a subtle effect, but it's cool. So I'm going to select the universal material node and go to the attributes. And we can also add things like sheen, which is similar to coating. So if I make this like bright red, you can see that's adding sort of a little bit of red thing. So it's kind of a similar effect as the coating. It does not have its own index of refraction, but it does have a roughness value. So let's set this just to black so we don't have to overdo it. So those are some of the other things that you can do with the universal material. If you do add a transmission value, making it transparent, so if you're going to do glass or something like that, you probably want to set metallic down to 0, but then you can come down here and play with the transmission properties and so on. So it's an extremely versatile material, but let's leave it at that for now. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this universal material. So right click over it and I'm going to choose copy. And then I'll go into, well, let's do this. Close this for a second. Select my Limo 1001 mat and hit view source. I already have the textures in here. So I'm going to right click, choose paste. It gives us that universal material. Let's set this to material out. And then we can start plugging in our textures. So here's base color. So we'll put base color into albedo. Let's put the normal texture into normal. Let's put metallic into metallic. And then roughness into roughness. And then our ambient occlusion into coating. Here we go. Let's see if we can see some of the a little bit better. Let's rotate the view so it looks like this. And then, of course, what we do need to do is we did make some adjustments here to the actual textures. So, for example, let's make sure we get that grayscale color. This is for the specular color. I'm going to copy this. Paste it. Put it into specular. Let's go back here. See what else we need. We don't have emissive on the wings, so we don't need to emissive texture. So let's make the roughness consistent. I'll select that roughness texture. If you recall, we set the gamma to 1260, so I'll switch to limo 1001 material. Select that roughness texture and set its gamma to 1.260. And let's connect it to the roughness input of the node and let it update. You'll see now they're starting to look a bit more consistent between the two parts of the spaceship. So the great thing about copying and pasting that universal material node from one tab in the node editor to the other is that a lot of the other settings, such as index of refraction and so on, were pasted as well. So I don't have to spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out what those are or what I used before. That makes things a lot faster. So I started a PBR viewport render, and I'm just picking a nice view here. And let's move this over a little bit. And I'm going to go into the kernel settings and just increase the samples a little bit to help remove some of the blotchiness that you see, some of that green blotchiness in the upper right. So I'll set it to 800. And here's the view I settled on for the final render. So I'll just let that calculate for a few moments. And there you go. There's the basics of using the universal material when rendering with Octane for Unity.